Dead Space is such a quality game made by passionate developers that even the taint of EA couldn't drag it down. Well, at least this title in the series. It's one of the most immersive, atmospheric, and best-paced games I've ever played. Each section doesn't overstay its welcome, it's constantly changing things up, and knows just when to end, not feeling that it was too short. The game is consistent in quality throughout, something that its two main inspirations, System Shock 2 and Resident Evil 4, failed to do. Dead Space keeps you tense and on edge throughout the entire game, which is something that most horror games failed to achieve. While the series would eventually succumb to the taint of EA, it's still an absolutely phenomenal title. So let's get to it and see how this game came together. The mid to late 2000s did see a bit of an odd shift within EA. With the shift in leadership, EA started to produce more original IPs in-house. Some other franchises that emerged around this time were the Skate games and Mirror's Edge. On the note of Mirror's Edge, expect a future video on the series. One studio within EA was EA Redwood Studios, which changed its names to Visceral Games in 2009 after the release of Dead Space. Their prior work included working on the Sims series, Lord of the Rings, some James Bond titles, and the Tiger Woods PGA Tour series. I put a lot of hours into the 2004 edition of that game. It was my jam. However, the studio always wanted to do a sci-fi horror title, something EA wasn't exactly known for. They wanted to do a System Shock 3. In reading through interviews and looking at behind the scenes, I couldn't outright confirm if they actually want to make System Shock 3 or something akin to a System Shock 3. Prior to Night Dive Studios acquiring the rights to the System Shock IP in the 2010s, the IP was in a messy space between EA and Star Insurance. Star Insurance acquired the assets of Looking Glass Studios when they shut down in 2000. However, along comes Resident Evil 4 in early 2005 and was a game changer for the industry, and for the team as well. It got them to shift into how they wanted to make the game, essentially creating Resident Evil in space. The team also looked at films like Event Horizon for heavy inspiration, with the idea of a spaceship going to hell. After pitching to the higher-ups in early 2006, they were given 6 months to create a vertical slice. Instead of the typical process at EA, which was design documents and slide decks, they went and created a playable prototype. As they didn't have access to dev kits of next-gen systems, the team prototyped using the original Xbox instead. With a small team of around 15 people to begin with, the team came up with a list of rules to follow. No HUD, a silent protagonist, the dismemberment system, no cutscenes. At the time, there was a recent shift in leadership at Electronic Arts with a new CEO. Under this new leadership, they wanted to create more original IPs. Instead of paying out licensing fees and royalties for other properties, why not make their own? Sadly, this didn't last too long at EA. Granted, some of these IPs they had run to the ground, Dead Space being one of them, but more on that later. But the game was a go, and then they went gung-ho. For about 3 months, Dead Space did have a co-op mode, which is something the series would revisit in the third series. They scrapped it to focus on the single player. There's a lot more behind the scenes I'll be covering throughout the video in this corresponding section. I do have to note that watching these developer insights into Dead Space are some of the better ones around. One in particular being the Ars Technica video with creator and director Glenn Schofield. The guy is an absolute master storyteller, and I could listen to him for hours.
Yeah, this here is the all the notes from my animation director, Chris Stone. He took all the notes from the meetings that we had because this one here is all about dismemberment. And you can see the different points that we were talking about. This is how we started. And then you can see number 2. And then we got more and more complicated as time went on and technology got better. But you can just see that the care that went into just dismemberment was something really special.
Watching these definitely got me more excited about the Callisto Protocol. This is an upcoming spiritual successor to Dead Space. He will return directing the game along with a number of Dead Space alumni working on it. To note, I am playing the PC version, so there are some wonky issues with it. As this is from 2008, this is the time frame where consoles really shifted to be the main focus, with PC as an afterthought. Luckily there's a mouse fix which just takes 2 seconds to install. If you are interested in checking out the game, I'll have a link to that below. Granted, it still feels a bit off in various sections, including the turret portions. And to get the game running in 60 frames per second, there's a bit of an odd workaround. I'll provide a link to how to get the game running in 60 frames per second. Dead Space takes place in 2508. Humanity has depleted resources on Earth and are exploring space to gather resources. They use ships known as planet crackers to harvest resources. I have to say that the term planet cracker is really cool. So simple, and yet you understand how it works right away with that name. We're playing as Isaac Clarke, just your everyman engineer sent to the planet cracker USG Ishimura to respond to a distress signal. He's not some space marine. Isaac also has a personal stake in going, with his girlfriend Nicole being aboard the Ishimura. Simple, but an effective way to get us to care more.
I wish I could just talk to someone. It's all falling apart here. I can't believe what's happening. Strange. Such a little thing.
How many times you watched that thing? Guess you really miss her. Don't worry, we're almost there. You'll be able to look her up once we're on board. Sounds like you do have a lot of catching up to do.
Something is very wrong on the ship. Where is everyone? Before we know it, we're dealing with some unknown creatures, our party's reduced in size, and we're separated. For most of the game, we'll be quote-unquote talking with Kendra Daniels and Zach Hammond. I say talking in quotations as Isaac is a silent protagonist. The team mentioned this was inspired by Half-Life 2. In a funny OEA moment, Glenn Schofield mentioned that someone from marketing suggested that they get a big actor to play Isaac. Now, Isaac isn't 100% silent. We could hear his grunts, his heavy breathing, his screams, and his heart rate going up. But save for the beginning and end of the game, Isaac is completely suited up. It's amusing to watch the intro and just focus on Isaac and how calm he is about everything.
What the hell? Sir, the auto dock. What is it? We're off track. We're gonna hit the hull. Hit the blast shields. Thank God this tail is damaged. Switch to manual, now.
Inside the magnetic field? Are you insane?
One of the shortcomings of Dead Space, and there aren't many, is that it throws these creatures, known as the necromorphs, at us far too quickly. The game doesn't give enough time to breathe and let us get settled into the ship and build up that tension. Compare this to, say, Alien Isolation, which I've done a video on, and how long the game takes to breathe before finally getting us to an alien. I'm guessing either two things happened here, or a combination of it. The team was inspired by Resident Evil 4 and got to the action quickly with enemies, where some higher up at EA said, hey, players might become bored if they don't see an enemy. So after being separated, we'll get a weapon, and introduced to the strategic dismemberment system. This system still remains mostly unique to the Dead Space series, which is something I find quite puzzling. It could have easily just been a gimmick, but it never feels that way and helps Dead Space stand out. Instead of focusing on the headshots,
Go for the limbs. Dismember them.
going for enemy heads are just going to piss them off further and create more issues. So instead, we go for the limbs, the legs, the arms. As a result, the enemies of Dead Space have a different appearance than other similar titles, more emphasis on the limbs. To fit better with the setting, the weapons we have access to are for the most part simple engineer tools used as weapons, like buzzsaws or cutters. It's the details like this that helps Dead Space feel less gamey, for better lack of a term, and more immersive. Now, as this combat design with the limbs is unique to Dead Space, the game makes it really clear early on, like really, really clear. I wager this is something that came from EA and the team compromised. I have this image that some higher up from EA came to the studio one day and told them playtesters were confused on cutting off the limbs. They also forgot to mention that their playtesters were Aaron Hansen and Darkside Phil.
Am I supposed to be shooting him in the head? Am I supposed to be shooting him in the eye? Does it only do damage if you shoot him in the eye?
Dead Space will throw a number of enemies our way, some in tight hallways, others in more open combat arenas where quarantines will lock us in with them. Having played a lot of Resident Evil just prior to Dead Space, I was a bit irked that there is no quick turn. This is something that was added in and removed several times throughout development. It was eventually removed due to playtesters using it accidentally. Again, perhaps they should have got playtesters besides Aaron Hansen and Darkside Phil here.
Down and circle quick turns. Okay, thank you guys. I didn't know about that. The game never explained it, so down and circle quick turns. Okay.
The game is constantly throwing new necromorphs at us in different combinations or more difficult versions of earlier enemies. There's also this one type that reminds me so much of the Orphan of Cause from Bloodborne. You could see some of the Lovecraftian influence in the appearance of some of these enemies, and also the effects they have on us, but more on that later. It feels super satisfying to cut off their limbs. There's a lot of weight and kick to our weapons and responses from enemies. And on the other way around, we could get some pretty gruesome death scenes our way. It's like the team looked at some of those great death scenes in RE4 and were like, yeah, we could do that better. We have a number of choices when it comes to weapons. You could hold up to 4 at one time, and the game will dish out ammo accordingly with what you have. I did carry 4 weapons for a bit, but I found myself gravitating towards 3 for most cases, so dropping 1 gave more ammo for the rest of the 3. They all have alternative fires, and they can be upgraded with the node system. I really enjoy the power node system for upgrades in Dead Space. They can be found throughout the game or purchased at the store. You have to choose various paths of the node on what you want to focus on, and sometimes a node will yield no benefits as there's nothing on that slot. As well, the game will have rooms that require a power node to be unlocked, so you have to consider that in the equation as well. More often than not, the cost of using a power node is worth it with what you'll pick up in these rooms. If they want to go less linear and focus more on horror, they could have even dialed this up. Instead of going through an area with lots of enemies, you could use a mode to take a shortcut, but miss out on various items. So we have a lot of decisions to be made here. It's not like the game will punish you in other ways. All styles are attainable and usable. You could just use a plasma cutter if you want the whole game just upgrading it. Very rarely did I find myself needing to purchase ammo, although near the very end of the game did I need it for a brief section. These aren't our only options we have. We can also stomp on them when they're down, which has a very satisfying feel of weight in its thuds. We could use stasis to slow them down to catch a breather, or use kinesis to throw shit at them. Granted, I rarely deviate from shooting them with weapons, but we do always have that option. There are various sections throughout Dead Space where we'll go into space. The team did intricate levels of research to make sure movement felt just right.
We studied, NASA and JPL websites. We found out how much a hand weighs, how much a head weighs in 0G because we wanted that realistic weight. And that was very, very important to the game.
And the game gets very, very quiet. A little sound beyond our breathing. There's no psycho strings to get our attention about enemies, which I'll discuss later. We also have these space vacuum sections. Jumping from one point to another is very enjoyable, although at times I didn't find it overly clear why certain jumps didn't seem to work. I also have a bit of mixed feelings in regards to the camera. It can be really confusing to figure out where you are in a room as a result. Again, I think that's part of the point. We're not used to these kind of situations, so it does add to that unease and tension. To get that movement right for 0G, the team got a bit creative to pull it off.
We went to Vancouver and started doing our mocap, and we're like, okay, how can we do 0G? And we tried just kind of mimicking, like walking in 0G, and that didn't work. So we're like, okay, what else can we do? And the one thing we came up with that was close was we had a couple of the guys at the studio tie bungee cables to my legs and then walk behind me with the bungee cables as I kind of like did this big sort of stepping look. And so that's what we started with 0G.
As well, the developers threw some extra hurdles our way with just how well some necromorphs perform in zero gravity. If you're not careful, they'll descend upon you before you know it. Like the Dismemberment system, I'm surprised how little the industry as a whole took a similar approach to its HUD than Dead Space. I'm all about minimal HUDs. In most games I play, I tend to turn off as much of the HUD as I can as possible. There are fewer things I find more frustrating than turning off aspects of the HUD, only to realize that the game was built around them with them in mind. For example, finding out where I need to go becomes impossible without quest objectives or a minimap. Dead Space does the UI and HUD in such a great way that not only minimizes everything so we can fully focus on the game, but makes sense within the game itself. Having the health of Isaac and energy levels on the back of his suit were inspired by scuba tanks. When you have a gun drawn, you're notified over the gun with how much ammo is available, instead of just appearing in a corner. Using the inventory is in real time as well. The game doesn't stop as you're going through it. Plus there's some nice little detail of Isaac's head moving around to look at the corresponding slot. It's these attentions to detail that really makes Dead Space such a standout title. With a button press, we could bring up the locator system that shows a blue line of where we need to go. This makes sense as well within the context of the game, of being able to figure out our way throughout the ship. It's interesting how this idea came about according to the UI lead of Dead Space. It was actually a fairly last-minute addition to the game.
So Dead Space 1 was designed to have this really amazing map system that sort of opened up and you would see exactly where you were and where your next objective was. And the problem with it was that it wasn't very useful. And so as pretty as it was, what we learned very fast was that nobody wanted to use it. This shipped with Dead Space 1, but we had to make another way to do it. And so the locator was born. I remember when this was made, I think we were in the last month of production when we were in a panic state, and we're like, oh my gosh, no one's ever gonna get to figure out where to go next, oh no. And then there was like two camps of thought. One was like, well, let's make this breadcrumb system that appeared on the ground. And the other camp that said, well then if we do that, no one would ever explore. And so it ended up being one of the most iconic elements of Dead Space UI. And to be honest, that's amazing because we just slapped it in last minute.
It's a real bummer that the industry as a whole went such a different direction than this, because it's such a solid foundation and does so much more for getting you immersed in the world. Although sometimes I would be a bit confused of where I need to go next after getting an objective from someone, but the journal can give better indication, or of course you could always use your locator system. This is something about being a silent protagonist. You're going to be constantly guided around and be told where to go. It's very much in the vein of the shot games. You'll get to a new location, Kendra or Hammond will tell you that something is broken or missing, and you need to go fix and find it. Something else will then happen, and therefore you have to do Y, rinse and repeat. There's nothing wrong with that really. It works fine for this style of game. It wasn't a case of me rolling my eyes that another hurdle was thrown our way. Granted, we are the engineer of the group. Come on, Kendra and Hammond, it'd been nice if you picked up some of the slack here. In their list of rules for Dead Space, the team mentioned no cutscenes, and Dead Space does so, well, sort of. It's in the same vein of Half-Life games not having cutscenes, being contained in a room while something plays out. With a few exceptions, there's a bunch of scenes here where we'll have someone talk to us behind a glass while we listen. It's a clunky situation, but does help with maintaining that immersion instead of cutting to a cutscene. So this being a ship where people live for long periods of time, the USG Ishimura feels like it lived in place. The team put a lot of thought and time into each area and of its layout, so it's not gamey but more like a real place. From crew quarters, mess halls, to a future version of basketball. It really helps add to one of the best atmospheres in gaming. The game takes that shock approach of being on a ship gone to hell, trying to piece together of everything that's happened aboard. This type of style works so well for video games, and of course Dead Space is no exception. The game doesn't go overboard with its lore, although they would flesh out this with sequels and comics, which I do appreciate how they kept it fairly self-contained. There's just a few other characters that we'll hear about their stories throughout Dead Space. Compare this especially to System Shock 2, when you have a whole wide range of characters that you're going to figure out their stories through audio logs. It hits that right level lore. Sometimes lore-heavy stories, whether shows, games, books, can get too swallowed up in adding more lore just for the sake of it. Here, the lore is added to help flesh out the themes of this world. Sound is integral to creating an experience that sucks you in, especially with horror, and Dead Space is at the very top amongst sound design. Everything from the sounds of Isaac, to interfaces we interact with, the sound of our weapons, a little sound in Zero-G, the sound of the necromorphs, it all comes together in a beautiful package. There's also various points that if you listen closely, you'll hear some creepy whispering.
Desire for social interaction, physical contact, affection, or support may lead you to make poor judgments and decisions in multiple areas.
So let's talk about what I find Dead Space's greatest weakness, the usage of its soundtrack. By that, I don't mean it's a bad soundtrack. In fact, it's fantastic. The ambient tracks add to the sense of dread on the USG Ishimura. The issues I do have is the use of what I call the psycho strings with the appearance of necromorphs. It's far too high in the mix and in your face. This is going to sound weird because if you're familiar with this channel and my love of games in the Shock series and Resident Evil, you'd think Dead Space has always been my jam. But truthfully, I played the demo around its launch and it never really clicked for me. A few years after that, I tried again, but dropped the game after the first hour or so. It wasn't until another try a few years ago and pushing forward that I fully got into it and love it. So what was one of the major differences I found? A lot of it was simply changing the music volume. First, I tried turning it off so there were no string swells to give indications of enemies. However, this meant no ambient tracks, so I tried turning the music volume to about a quarter. This was perfect. The string swells with the appearance of necromorphs weren't so high up and they didn't take me out of the experience. It's less about the psycho strings themselves. They're well composed, but they were just way too high up in the mix. Let's now delve into the horror of Dead Space. Glenn Schofield mentioned he set out to make the scariest game ever made. Well, I don't think they reached that. They did create a masterclass in horror that keeps you tense all the way throughout the game. Granted, horror is quite subjective. I've always felt that the Japanese have always done game horror better. But as far as Western horror goes, you can't do much better than Dead Space. Dead Space never lets up on the tension throughout the game. Most of my time playing Dead Space, I've had my weapon drawn while slowly going around the corner. To To be able to hold this tension throughout the entire playthrough just may very well be Dead Space's greatest achievement. It's not uncommon for horror games to lose their luster the further you go into the game and you become desensitized to scares. To help avoid this, the team were meticulous with iterations to get timing just right to keep those scares constant without overdoing them. The team realized that having things jump out at you over and over would get old, so to address this, they used a procedural system. The system helped determine when enemies would spawn and come out of vents. So with each playthrough, it isn't always going to be the case that enemies will pop out the same way every time. One of the game's highlights in regards to enemies is having an enemy pursue us that we can't kill. It simply regenerates. To have to deal with it a number of times and escape, while dealing with other enemies, and finally getting to finish it off later on, is really satisfying.
Test firing shuttle engines.
While Dead Space does a great job on the jump scare department, it also delivers psychological horror in droves. Walking around the ship, seeing what remains, the lighting, the mood, counting other survivors who have gone mad. If anything, I feel that Dead Space does psychological horror just as well as it does jump scare horror. While most games tend to go with one or the other, Dead Space uses an excellent balance of the two, which results in a tale that manages to keep you on edge throughout the entire playthrough. Now we're going to get into more plot spoiler territory, just to let you know, so I can delve further into the rest of the game. Dead Space manages to remain in quality throughout the entire game, something that's two main inspirations, System Shock 2 and Resident Evil 4, struggled with. System Shock 2 had a noticeable drop in quality post Von Braun, and the island section Resident Evil 4 doesn't hold up to the castle or the village section. That's not to say that Dead Space doesn't have its shortcomings. I'd say the first chapter is weakest, due to the fact it doesn't get enough time to let that tension build up. While I don't feel there were chapters that felt like a drop in quality, there were a few noticeable sections that could use some more love, or removed altogether. I know the asteroid turret section has a reputation. I didn't have any issues with it. Looking up, it was an issue on consoles as opposed to PC due to the controls. Speaking of asteroids, the section I found the most frustrating was releasing the asteroid. Not the good kind of frustrating. It was also navigating through this room that would shoot fire periodically. There were a few times where I was torched by fire, even though I was fairly certain I was safe. And while a great spectacle, I did find the final boss pretty disappointing. For something that size, you'd think it'd be able to hit me more while I'm just casually moving side to side. Beyond that, I don't have much to complain about here. The game just knows the right balance of stretching things out before they become tedious and switches things up. Oh, and calling the last chapter Dead Space? I love when games do that. On the story front, through environmental storytelling, or talks with Hammond and Kendra, audio logs, text logs, we could start to piece together what happened here. While the plant below was being used to extract resources, it was also the source of a red marker. This is a relic of the religion known as Unitology, which comes across as a mishmash of Scientology and other cult organizations. The game does dive into some of these religious themes, something that most games tend to avoid. And while it's not the forefront of the story here, it does create a nice backdrop of lore that helps flesh out the world. Bringing the red marker on board, people start going mad, with necromorphs coming aboard from the planet below, which turn corpses into necromorphs. One thing that we find out that's common for people to hallucinate loved ones, even though they aren't on this ship or dead. Kendra mentions that she sees her brother. A lot of these psychological elements of horror come from hearing these audio logs and what happened to those on board as the madness started to sink in. And as the game progresses, Kendra and Hammond become more confrontational with one another, with it being implied that Hammond knows more than he's letting on.
Kendra, if you can hear me, see if you can get into the ship's reports. It sounds like you have better access from there.
When were you going to tell us about the artifact, Hammond? This marker?
I don't know anything about that. It's referenced in the captain's records.
Turns out it was actually Kendra.
Hurry! There's no time to waste. We must do it. Wait. Amelia. Where are you going?
Sorry, Isaac. I couldn't let him go through with it. I suppose I should thank you for finding the marker. We even managed without help from the USM Valor.
She was brought in to bring the red marker back. It's not a shocking twist, but it does do a good job of hiding her true intentions throughout the game and getting us to think Hammond was the one who was up to no good. As well, while it feels like retribution for her meeting her demise, I couldn't help but feel a bit sorry for her when she was killed.
Oh my god!
And on the personal story of Isaac and Nicole, the game makes great use of dramatic irony. Nicole has been dead all along, and we have been hallucinating her. The game doesn't exactly hide this fact. If you put 2 and 2 together, you'll have this concluded well before Isaac learns. It's not meant to be a shocking twist. Having Isaac be a silent protagonist does help with the story beat. When we run into her, you can tell something's a bit off. There's also this really nice moment where Isaac learns the truth and the way he reacts. So much is said with so little. Another neat touch, if you take the first letter of every chapter, it spells out Nicole is dead. I really enjoyed the story of Dead Space. It uses that model that titles like System Shock helped pioneer. One thing I appreciate about Dead Space compared to some of these other titles is through the text and audio logs, keeps it to a fairly small cast of characters. Titles like System Shock 2 or Prey would have far more characters in these audio logs, and it could be fairly difficult to keep track of everyone and know how their story plays out, some obviously getting more writing treatment than others. By keeping a small cast of characters, we could follow their arcs more clearly, have them fleshed out to a greater extent, and have better focus on the themes of Dead Space. So, with that, let's look what happened to Dead Space after its release. Dead Space sales at first weren't overly high, although it did improve over time due to the critical acclaim that the game received. It wasn't the only new IP that didn't meet sales expectations for EA. Mirror's Edge, which launched around the same time, also failed to meet expectations. Dead Space was released in October 2008, right around the time when the global recession was kicking in, so that needs to be considered. However, they would release plenty of expanded universe material, comic books and movies, and would be followed up with a sequel released in early 2011. The EA influence would continue to grow. Despite very strong sales figures, EA was still disappointed by Dead Space 2 sales, and pushed for Dead Space 3 to reach a broader audience and include co-op, which of course backfired and sold well below Dead Space 2, at which point the series was put on ice. In a way, it's not unlike how they treated another sci-fi series that was under their umbrella and would run to the ground, Mass Effect. Although from researching and behind-the-scenes shenanigans of both franchises, Mass Effect looks to have been much more BioWare tying their own noose compared to Visceral Games. And adding to the EA's growing list of studio kill counts, Visceral Games was shut down in 2017. At the time, the studio was working on a Star Wars title helmed by Amy Hennig, best known for her work on the Uncharted series. EA for a long time has been looking to move away from linear, single-player games and use every excuse under the sun to do so, something that Visceral Games has mostly focused on, linear, single-player games. This always amuses me that despite looking at sales numbers of top-selling games, single-player games still continue to sell well. Granted, I guess it's a lot harder to put microtransactions in single-player linear games, isn't it, EA? What about Glenn Schofield? In mid-2009, he and Michael Condrey, who was one of the higher-ups working on Dead Space, co-founded Sledgehammer Games. They pitched to Activision to make a third-person Call of Duty, and were brought into the fold as a studio to work on the series. However, this title was shelved to help assist other studios on the series, and would later get their own chance to lead development on future titles. In mid-2019, Glenn Schofield would become CEO of a new studio, Striking Distance, a studio within the PUBG Corporation. He's now directing the Callisto Protocol, a title set in the PUBG universe. Sounds like a weird fit, but Glenn wants to make the scariest game on next-gen platforms, and that's what he's trying to achieve with the Callisto Protocol. The team consists of a number of people who worked on the Dead Space series, Visceral Games, and Sledgehammer Games. Replaying Dead Space, it really got me excited for this game, so keep an eye on it. It really looks to be a spiritual successor to Dead Space. In another tie-in with Mass Effect and how much EA loves their money, I wouldn't be shocked to see some kind of remastered edition of the Dead Space series akin to the Mass Effect series which just released. We'll use it to test the waters to see if they should expand the universe further. Granted, EA being EA, they'll screw the pooch in some way. The Callisto project is the one to keep an eye on. Thank you everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video on Dead Space. Like, subscribe, comment if you haven't done so. If you'd like to support the channel further, check out my Patreon. I offer a weekly newsletter, early access to videos, get featured in the credits here if you're a Tier 3 patron. Thanks again everyone. Boulder Punch out.